Access applications are typically thought of as being applications to be used by a single person or a relatively small group of people who all have access to a common location to hold the data. Now, of course, the common location is essential, and earlier on in the course we looked at holding the data in SQL Server and how the Access front end can deal perfectly well with this. One of the other constraints is the need to actually have Access installed on client machines or to deliver Access applications as runtime versions to be installed on client machines. With Access 2013, however, the ability to develop an Access application as a web app has been delivered in a pretty powerful form. What this means is that you can develop a database application in Access where those main constraints have been removed. The data can be held in SQL Server seamlessly to you, and the clients do not need to have an Access runtime or an Access front end installed. They can access your database using a web browser. Now, this is such an important development, and it is being increasingly used, that I want to spend a section or two going over the basics of setting up an Access web app. Now, the development of web apps really has some good news and some bad news from your point of view as a developer. The good news is that the front end is a web browser, and I'll assume that your users all have a web browser of a reasonably modern variety that they can access your web apps with. The bad news is that the back end, although it's going to be held in SQL Server, it needs to be accessed via Microsoft SharePoint, and specifically Access services within Microsoft SharePoint. If at work or even at home you have a SharePoint installation, then that's fine, you can use that, and that will do to give you access to SQL Server via SharePoint. If you don't have a SharePoint installation, and most people don't, then you're going to need access to a SharePoint installation. Now, you may think that's going to be a real block to you in terms of learning to use web apps, but you can get access to SharePoint using an Office 365 account. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing in these sections. You can get a trial account, and if you just want to try this out, use a trial account for that. If not, Office 365 accounts for small businesses and for individuals are really economically priced. I pay a very low price for the one that I use, and with that, the power of being able to develop web apps is very impressive. Now, I'm currently running Access from a standard Microsoft Live account, a Microsoft account. I don't have access to SharePoint, but I do have an Office 365 account as well. You need to be running in an account that has access to SharePoint. So what I'm going to do now is switch accounts, and then we'll see about creating a web app. Okay, I'm now logged in with an account that has access to SharePoint. What we're going to do is to create a web app. Now, the little graphics that appear for each of the database templates that you can see on the new screen here, the ones with a picture of a world after them are the web app types, and the ones with a page with a folded over corner are the desktop types. And we could choose, for example, to create a contact database or an asset tracking database, but let's just start with custom web app. This is a very simple, straightforward custom web app to begin with, and then as I'll show you, you can customize that to your specific requirements. So let's start with custom web app. Click on that. I'm now offered a choice of locations for my app. In my case, there are two offered to me. One of them is to create it as a personal app, which is usually the one that I choose until I'm happy with a particular app, or I can publish it to my team site, which I can share with other people that have access to my team site in SharePoint Online. I'm going to stick with personal apps. What we do from now on isn't really affected by the choice that you make here, really. Obviously it would be if it came to publishing and so on, but as we're only going to do some basic development, the choice here is not particularly important, but let's stick with the default there of personal apps. Click on Create, and Microsoft Access creates my web app. Now it's worth noting the number of different ways you have of building a web app in Access 2013. We've started with what is effectively an empty Access database, and we can now add tables from all sorts of sources. If you click a search term into this box, you can actually look for examples of pre-prepared tables for the sort of thing that you want to do. So the examples here: suggested searches, person, order, service. So if you want a typical table layout for a person, just search on the term person. You'll be given one or more options, and you can potentially use that table layout as a starting point for your table layout. Down in the bottom left is a straightforward Add New Table button. But you can also create a table from an existing data source, and that's what I'm going to do on this occasion. I'm going to click down here on Access, and what it lets me do is to choose an existing Access database. Now I must admit I'm going to cheat a little bit here, because I'm going to use the back end of the latest version of the Movies database. Click on OK, and let's have the movie table and say the movie genre table to begin with, and maybe the country table as well. The imports were successful, and I now have those three tables imported into my database and ready for me to use. Now what we have here is quite unfamiliar looking, but there is perhaps more familiarity than you think. If you click on the navigation pane button here on this Home tab, the only tab on the ribbon at the moment, you'll see the familiar navigation pane appear on the left. You'll see the three tables whose definitions we've just imported, and for each of these tables Access has created two forms: a datasheet view form and a list view form. More of those in a moment. So in this case we've imported the table definitions and the data for just three of the tables, and if we select one of them, say table country, if we want to look at the list view, select that. It might be quite difficult at the moment to see the layout of that list view, but you'll get a better idea of that in just a moment. Similarly with the datasheet view, there's only a single field here, which is basically the name of the country, so it's a very simple layout to see. But if I say went for table movie, then you can see how the datasheet view is laid out, and you can of course edit that view. So if you click on edit, then you can go in, you can change column widths, you can reorder columns, you can do a whole range of adjustments on that. You can remove fields, add fields, and so on. Now for many people, when they first see this, I think they find it more than a little baffling, and it does take quite a bit of getting used to, but I really don't think it's as bad as it might at first seem. First thing to note here, of course, is that as you start to do things like design of a view, you start to get the familiar tabs and so on the ribbon. But I want to go back to the Home tab. Just bear in mind what you've just seen in those couple of examples. Go back to the Home tab. And let's actually look at what this will look like to a user using a web browser. So go to the Home tab and click on Launch Apps. Now you may well need to log in order for this to work. I've already logged in, and there you can see the datasheet view of Table Movie. Now just bear in mind what we were looking at just now, the datasheet view layout is there. That's exactly what the user sees. And in a way, this is the most important aspect of Access web apps. You can give somebody the URL of your database, and you can give them the permission to access it, and then from a browser, without any component of Access installed at all, they can access your Access database in this way. Your data is stored in a SQL Server database and accessed via Access Services in Microsoft SharePoint, and you can develop applications which are very sophisticated. As we'll see in a little while, you can write macro code to support your applications, and you can publish an Access database in this way to users who only have the address and permission to access it. Now, a couple of other things here. I'm going to go back into Access itself and do a little bit more work on this in just a moment, but I want to point out a couple of important things. Pretty much all of the basic necessary user interface element of your database is provided by default by Access. Some of the icons and some of the symbols, again, take a little bit of getting used to. But if you look at this datasheet view of our movies, obviously controls like checkboxes, you know how they work. But if you want to say add a record, there's an add button there to add a record. But watch what happens when I do this. You also have standard interface components to deal with things like changes. So I'm going to discard the change I just made. And you also have the little bin symbol there if you want to delete a record, and so on. So although there are some very noticeable visual differences, the basic standard facilities that you need in Datasheet View are there. Now let's take a look at List View, and in particular a little problem that I've let happen here just to show you the sort of thing that happens and how it looks in web apps. Let's go into List View, and you can see that we don't really have a genre recorded, or any genre recorded, for that first movie. And in fact, when I imported those three tables, I quite deliberately missed one in order to illustrate the kind of problem that you can get. We need the genre table, just not the total movie genre table, but it's absolutely no problem to go back in and import another table, or indeed to get a table from a completely different source. So all I need to do is to go back into Access. If I click on Table, it takes me back to the Add Tables area, where of course I can either do the search or I can add a table manually. I'm going to click on Access again. This time get the genre table. Now when I go back into the internet browser and click on table genre, I can see all of the genre there. If I go back to the movie table, then what I should now be able to do is to add an entry for the genre of this particular movie. Now if I click on add table movie genre, I get a suitable dialog here, so the movie that's selected in the list there is shown here, and I would like to be able to choose one of the genre to include here. Now I could type in one of the available genres, so for instance if I said drama and then click on save, if I just close that now, you'll see that's now appeared as one of the genre. And then of course I can add another one. But clearly there's a bit of a problem here. I'd much rather have a drop down list, and this appears to be a text box. Now this is in itself an entity in the database, so let's have a look at the design of this form here, and let's replace that text box with a combo box. So I'm back in Access. Let's go to Table Movie Genre List. I'm just going to hide the field list for the moment. There is basically the layout of that particular form. I just need to move over slightly. You can see there the controls that appear, the buttons that enable you to do various things such as add, delete, edit, save and cancel. Prompts, movie and genre, and there are the fields. You've got a field movie and a field genre. Click on the buttons by genre. The first button is the data button. It says the control name is genre text box. The control source is genre, that's the genre field in the Table Movie Genre table, and there's no default value in there at the moment. We then have a formatting button that enables us to enter a tooltip to say whether that particular control is visible or not, whether it's enabled, and then we can also include an input hint. And then the third button there gives us the option to put in actions, an on-click action and an after update action. So at the moment all I really want to do is to get rid of that control and replace it by a combo box. Now if I select it and just press the delete key, it's gone. Now I can go up to the controls here. I can choose combo box. I can then move it into position over here. Set its properties. There's no data source at the moment, but it needs to be genre. I'm going to call it genre combo box. its row source type is a table or query, and the row source is going to be tuple genre. Obviously I could create a query and perhaps put the genre in alphabetical order, for example, if I needed to. Then I have a number of other options. The main one of these is the bound field, which is genre, and the display field is also genre. And I think that should be enough for now. So let me just close that, save the changes. Let's go back into the web browser and have another look. Note now the genre is a drop down. I could of course put a default value in there. Let's try the drop down. I think we'll call it a mystery as well, shall we? Click on save, close, and we now have two genres for that movie. So there we are. We've not only done some preliminary work on getting this database started, but we've changed the design of a form. And one very important point about this is that one of the ideal ways to develop web apps is to use this approach of working in Access and then previewing what you've done frequently in an internet browser, and of course using different internet browsers as well. Well, there are our first few steps in Access web apps. Join me in the next section for some more.